Guys, is U.S. intelligence sharing its classified assessments of Ukraine and Russia as a psyop? And of course, is Russia focusing their efforts now onto Donetsk City? I'm going to break it all down right now. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran, and this is December 4th, 2022. Okay, first off, when we look at the tactical map, you can see that while there's been some significant offensive efforts across the Donetsk City region, we've talked about this. I think the DNR securing their capital city is pretty essential to them. And I think they really believe that they can try to effect an encirclement around this Avdiivka. And you can see that they're trying to expand out this northern prong and this southern prong. What's interesting is that it's also been concurrent with two offensive efforts here, which may be part of trying to seize this chain of villages that notably contain an airstrip, right? This has some significant military value, even though you can see it's a very small airstrip. But oftentimes, if you have existing aircraft facilities, especially a flat, stable runway, you can expand it a little bit, or you can repurpose it and put it to military use. We've talked about this, that the military doesn't need the same facilities as civilian aircraft. Oftentimes, they have ways they can operate on shorter runways. They can often operate on less improved runways, but of course, the most important thing they need is space. And I think especially you have to remember the DNR, they have been fighting for a long time, but they have been on the offense for very little of that time. And so the DNR commanders may have very limited understandings and limited capabilities in terms of planning and executing offensive operations, especially at scale. So what I think you're actually going to see, you're seeing some pretty crude tactics, right? Like thinking you're just going to march across this line of villages is indeed a very simplistic tactical look. This is like 14-year-old playing StarCraft level tactics. And, it looks like maybe they're trying to do the same thing here in Marinka. But yeah, you can almost discern sometimes, even from this limited data, the sort of thinking behind some of these commanders, and you can discern the varying levels of sophistication, right? You can see a little more sophistication in this encirclement effort. When we've talked about Bakhmut, we've seen that there is definitely a dearth of professionalism, right? Wagner Group, these are civilians, often prisoners recruited to do this fighting, and many of their commanders have left or been KIA'd over the past 7 or 8 years that they've been conducting operations, not just in Ukraine at times and in occupied Ukraine, but also in places like Syria and Africa. And of course, you can also see Russia continues to sporadically try to seize Bilohorivka and has tried to close this salient here, which is interesting. Again, we've talked in previous videos how when you see these big bulges in the line, they are not sustainable long term. Either your other forces have to come up to their line and create a more even salient, or the enemy forces are going to crush them from 3 directions, front, north, and south in this case. So I suspect that these attacks are part of an effort to relieve pressure and to attempt to create some relief on this salient here. But the real interesting part, when we pivot over to ground news, the U.S. intelligence chief has actually shared parts of their intel assessment. Expecting a reduced tempo in the fighting to continue for months is the highlight, right? But when we click at one of the articles, and Stars and Stripes is a government newspaper, but that is where I would expect government statements to be reported in their most complete form. And we can read it and tease out a little bit about what was said. Stars and Stripes is also good because they're military. They sometimes include details that a civilian reader might miss, but will be actually pretty salient to a military reader. So, right, the head of U.S. intelligence says that fighting in Russia's war is running at a reduced tempo. I think we've seen that. I think that makes sense. Everywhere but Bakhmut, of course. and suggests Ukrainian forces could have brighter prospects in the coming months. This is Avril Haines, who alluded, also discussed that they suspect that Putin's advisors have been shielding him from bad news about their war developments, but that he is becoming more informed of the challenges that the military faces in Russia. This is interesting, right? Because it implies, right? That's the overt text. The subtext is the U.S. is saying, hey, we have sources inside the Kremlin that are sharing that know exactly what information is being directed to Putin. Now, whether that's an actual human intelligence source, whether that's the ability to read emails, whether that's just somebody's phone has been hacked and they don't turn their phones off when they go into meetings with Putin, which, based on everything else the Russian Ministry of Defense has done, I would expect nothing less than that level of incompetence. So that slowly they're trying to ease Putin into the reality of the Russian military effort. And I suspect that it's possible that the inner circle itself is also protected from bad news. And Russia's not alone in doing this. I've talked in previous videos that the problems with the Afghan army, where they would have huge attrition rates, where the number of soldiers fighting on paper and receiving paychecks would often be 10 times or more the number of actual war soldiers that would report for duty. So your company of Afghan army soldiers would have 200 people on paper and 200 people would draw salaries, but around 180 of them would not show up to work. They would just go home and continue to draw salaries, or sometimes would even do other work like farming, so drawing 2 salaries at once. And the problem is that this information would be reported honestly at some levels, and then as it moved up the chain, it looked really bad for commanders. And the first commander to report this reality would look really bad. They would look incompetent, because if the previous commander lied and said the company has 200 soldiers, and then the next commander comes in and goes, actually, there's 20. That commander who reports the bad news, he looks bad. He looks like the one who lost 180 soldiers. They'd go, what did you do? Last year, this company was fully staffed. And then the commander has to go, well, I think your previous person lied to you, but he doesn't know that, because he wasn't here last year. And so you have this dynamic that plays out. It happens at every level, where bad news gets massaged into good news. And I think it's one of the chief reasons that the U.S. persisted in Afghanistan so long, because bad news was massaged and left out and recontextualized until it looked like progress. And it was sort of like that MC Escher drawing, where it's always stairs going up, but they never actually elevate. And I suspect that's what's happening to Putin, right? He's getting massaged and politically reworded and selected reports about the military, where it looks like they're always making progress without necessarily seeing without necessarily getting the reality where there's some really bad news. And he's been getting polished lies basically for so long that no one wants to be the person who's going to pull the wool over his eyes. It'll be too abrupt and too shocking to see the truth. So they say, it's not clear to us that he has a full picture of just how challenged they are, which implies, of course, that the U.S. has access to Russia's some level of accurate Russian force assessments, and that they're able to contrast them with what Putin is looking at. That is really interesting. It implies that, that the U.S. has access to, say, the actual combat strength numbers of large portions of the Russian military, and they have access to the reports that Putin's getting about their combat strength. Interesting. And they said, honestly, we're seeing kind of a reduced tempo already in the conflict. This implies that already implies that they actually expected to see Russia start to run out of steam later, but they're seeing it earlier, right? So that means, of course, that they have the U.S. has some forecast about when they think the Russian war machine is going to exhaust itself, and that it's exhausting itself earlier than U.S. intel reports suggested. So you guys could see, obviously, that they have their own assessments of Russian logistics and military capabilities, and that they've already forecasted a rate of attrition. She said her team expects that both sides are going to look to refit, resupply, and reconstitute for a possible Ukrainian counteroffensive in the spring. But she adds, we have a fair amount of skepticism as to whether or not the Russians will be prepared to do that. Right? So that probably implies, as we've discussed, that the Russians don't appear to be actually engaging in resupply, reconstitution, and refit operations. Right? And when we look at the map, I mean, this doesn't require open source to tell you that we can watch them. We watch them take no more than 24 hours before attacking again, right? We see it in Bakhmut. Every 24 to 48 hours, they launch ground assaults. And it implies that they are building up their forces only enough to conduct these assaults without effect, right? And would they be better off by digging deep fortifications and then spending the whole winter trying to train their troops, get them properly supplied, staff up their battalions and brigades, and then go on the offensive? Yeah, that seems to be what Ukraine is doing, but it's not what Russia's doing. And I think that's what she alludes to here, that they have a fair amount of skepticism as to whether or not the Russians will be prepared to do that, to go on the counteroffensive in the spring. And she adds, I think more optimistically for the Ukrainians in that time frame. So I think what she's saying is, I think about my thinking. I think what she means is my thinking is more optimistic for the Ukrainians to be able to refit and go on the offensive in that time frame, right? And so this is probably a reflection of the fact that obviously her intelligence apparatus is getting information fed from the DoD, who's mentoring on some level the Ukrainian forces. Again, the Kharkiv offensive, it became pretty clear that U.S. forces, U.S. high-level planners were very involved in that process for the Ukrainians. I think they probably prepared several courses of action. And here's the thing. You would be crazy not to, because the U.S. cannot show they can't show Ukraine all of their top secret information, right? They've got stuff behind the curtain that lets them see deep into Russia and its capabilities. They have obviously satellites, publicly disclosed ones, but then a lot that probably aren't public. And when you have all this intel, you can do better planning, right? They have maps and mapping software that would make Google Earth look like a coloring book. And when you have all this access, right, but you can't show it to your friends, it's sort of like, it's like you have to drive. I'm trying to think of a good analogy. If you have to drive across town, right, and you have a car, and your friend has a helicopter, and your friend's like, listen, you gotta drop your kid off at daycare. Listen, I got the helicopter. I'll get him there in 5 minutes, but the helicopter doesn't have room for you. Just drop him off. If you trust your friend, of course you're gonna do it. You're gonna be like, yeah, why would I make my kid wait 2 hours in traffic in Midtown or whatever? Or I can get him there in 5 minutes with someone who I trust. And that's what it is. The U.S. is like, listen, we spend your entire GDP, Ukraine, on just our intelligence and planning and military apparatus. Like, let us do some of the work, and then we'll give you the outcome, and you just have to trust that it's backed by really good data. And I think that's what happened in this event. So that's why I think the Ukrainians have a ton of why the U.S. has a ton of insight into the Ukrainian military planning efforts, right? Obviously, the British Ministry of Defense had released their own public intelligence estimate, and that they found that many independent Russian media outlets were finding that support for the Russian military campaign was falling significantly. Even the Kremlin himself said that 55% of respondents backed peace talks with Ukraine, while only 25% wanted the war to go on. Obviously, Kremlin-backed polls are almost works of fiction, but it's telling that the Kremlin itself is trying to gin up the appearance that they too are interested in peace talks, which is what this is. Because if the poll found something else, that one, they would just tweak the numbers until they did, or they would just not say anything. And of course, another independent pollster found that this was actually true. 53% of respondents supported peace talks. 41% said talked about continuing the fight. 6% were undecided. These are the Chads who know the Soviet system, never offer an opinion. But it is interesting that about these polls are putting out the same number of people who want to see peace talks. So, right, this is a really interesting way to discern. And I hope you guys saw that, the US, it's like everything else on the internet. A lot of good information is publicly available if you look for it. If you go off of TikTok and read some reports, dig into the truth, get into the data, it's out there. Just 99.9% of people don't actually scratch behind the surface of what they want to know. And so, guys, that's all I had for you for today. I hope this was insightful. And of course, if you want access to the combat video breakdowns and support the channel, right? Because a lot of my content gets demonetized. You guys become a member of the Patreon, right? I drop a new video every week, breaking down all the latest viral combat videos. And thanks to my Lieutenant tier patrons. You guys are the ones who make this whole thing possible. I'll see you all on the next one.